Visually, we're not going to change anything on the page that we've been working on, but we're going to make it a little bit more efficient and more robust. We're going to start off by making some variables. So I'll just do this inside the gallery section. I'm going to make 2 new variables, one to store the numbers per row and one to store my margin settings. So what we'll do here is we'll just go ahead and plug in our margins. I'm going to use them here on the LI, so instead of using my 2% and 2%, I'll use my margin variable. And then I'm also going to use the margin variable in my width calculation. So currently I have my 100% and I'm subtracting 3 times 2% because I'm using 4 columns, and I'm subtracting the margin on the right on 3 of those. We're going to change this slightly. So in our parentheses here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to change this to num per row minus 1. So we'll always subtract 1. So right now the num per row is 4. If I subtract 1, that's going to give me 3. And then we're going to multiply the entire thing by our margin, and we'll divide by num per row. For the nth child right here, instead of using 4n, let's plug a variable in here too, so that I'll just have one global place where I can control the numbers per row. In case I want to change that, I'll be able to easily do that. So down here in my nth child, we were using 4n to be able to remove the margin on the right of the 4th one. I'm going to plug in here inside of the parentheses. I'm going to use the hash sign, and then I'll use curly braces, and I'm going to use my variable num per row. And then after the curly brace, I'm going to put n right here. So this is going to get whatever number this is and assign it as the nth number. Because I'm passing the variable name inside the curly braces, I need to have the number sign. This is part of interpolation right here. If we save our page and we look in the browser, we're going to see that nothing has changed. But if I change the number of rows here, so if I make this 6 and we save and we refresh, you can now see that the numbers per row changes to 6. And I could change this to 3 or 2 or any value, and my page is simply going to update, and all of my CSS with the margins on the rights is going to work because I performed some math calculations. So you can see just by adding these variables, this becomes much more flexible. So to increase the flexibility of this even more, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a mixin. So after my variables, I'll go ahead and create a mixin, and I'm going to call this row maker. And inside the parentheses, I'm going to pass on arguments that I want the user to be able to add. So we're going to use our num per row, and I'm going to use my margin. Because I'm going to declare these here as arguments, I no longer need the variables that we created earlier. So I'm just going to delete those. And then for the mixin, we're going to use this calculation right here. Our width, 100% minus the num per row minus 1 times margin divided by num per row. So I'm just going to grab this and cut it, and we'll include that inside of our mixin. The next thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to use an ampersand inside of the mixin. We'll call our nth child, and we're just going to put n in here as the argument, and then we'll specify that we want the margin to be 0, margin and 0. And then inside the li item, I'm going to include my mixin, so we'll use an @include. We'll put the name of our mixin, row maker, and then I'm going to pass on the parameters. So let's try 5 columns, and we'll do 1% for the margin, just so we can test this and see if it's working. Now if we save our page and we refresh in the browser, we're going to have an error, and it's letting us know that we're using an undefined variable of margin. If we look right here, we're declaring our margin variable, which we had deleted. Now the variables are associated with our mixins, and I don't need this line of code anymore because I've moved it up here anyways. So let's just get rid of this line of code. And then we also need to get rid of this number per row because we're going to get the same error message. It's going to tell us that we're using a variable that is out of scope essentially. We've never declared this variable other than being inside of our mixin. So that means it's only available from the Mixin. So I'm going to actually get rid of this as well, and I'll just cut that. We're going to need to use it a little bit later, so I'll just keep it in my clipboard. If we save and go back into the browser and refresh, you can see that we get our page, it's showing with the 4 up, but we aren't getting the 5 up. And the reason why is because we specified that we wanted to have 5 columns, but remember that we're adding margin settings now. We're passing on margins on the right of 1%. So that means that this number is going to exceed 100%. What we need to do to resolve this is we need to take that information that we just cut, the nth child selector that's specific for the margin on the right, and we're going to need to add that to our Mixin. So up here in the Mixin, I'm going to add that same line of code that I just cut, the ampersand nth child. We're going to pass on the value that is plugged in on number per row, and then we're going to have that have a margin right of 0. So whatever that number is, that one nth child of the LI item is always going to have a margin right of 0. If we save and we refresh in the browser, you can now see that I get my 5 columns, and that's going to stay that way as I resize. The images are just going to scale. If we come back into brackets and I change this to a 2 and I save it, well, now these values are going to change and it's going to give me a 2-up layout. So you can see that this becomes very flexible. Now, in order to make it a little bit more robust, we're going to also use a media query so we can have this change. We want it to have 5 columns at the large size, and let's even give it 2% margin. So if I save this now, it's going to give me 5 columns, and I'm going to have more spacing that's going to appear around the edges. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pass on a media query so that when our page is a little more narrow, we're going to lessen the amount of columns. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to include my media query right here nested so that only the gallery LI items are going to be affected by this media query. So we're just going to do it right here nested inside of our SASS. I'm going to put media and I'm going to use max width, which of course isn't mobile first, but for this example, we're just going to build it this way. So I'm going to use 800 pixels for my max width, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to use our @include directive and include our Mixin of row maker. And we'll just pass on that we want it to be 4 columns and 1% for the margin. If we save and we refresh in the browser, we still have our 5-column layout, and as my page gets reduced down, once it hits that media query of 800 pixels or less, it's going to go to a 4-column layout. So you can see how robust and flexible it is to be able to do something like this. And obviously we could just continue to add media queries and change this up depending on our needs. So maybe at 500 pixels, I'm going to reduce it down to 3 columns. If we save now and we refresh, here's our page, and as I reduce down, when I get to anything that's less than 600 pixels, it goes to 3 columns. Now, obviously, we have some issues with our H2. It's wrapping. The line height is kind of weird. I'm not going to worry about that right now. You know how to fix that. We would just continue to build the page. But what I did want to be able to share with you is that we're using math, and now we're wrapping the math into a Mixin, and it's really allowing us to create a flexible page that we can do a lot with. I think that you're going to find these techniques to be extremely important as part of your web development workflow.